Hello and welcome to the Out of the Lab podcast, where we discuss the operational challenges in cell and gene therapy. Each episode, we sit down with a different voice in the space, from executives and scientists to patients and advocates, to figure out exactly where the industry is breaking down and how to fix it. This episode is brought to you by Method Made. Accelerate your tech transfer by up to 6 months using video SOPs to capture technical nuance. Take the complete interactive product tour at methodmade.ca. Last thing before we get started, quick shout out to the executive producer, Tatiana Matviva, for her work in guest selection and topic choice. In today's episode of Out of the Lab, I'm joined with Alfred Sloan, expert in cell and gene therapy with 20 years of experience. Alfred, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nico, for having me. Look forward to our conversation today. Quite exciting.
Awesome. Well, Alfred, something we briefly touched on that I'm looking forward to getting into in this conversation is around the current capital environments for cell therapy development and how the current constraints are pushing asset developers to really speed through R&D and process development to get to the clinic as quickly as possible. So love to hear your take on what's going on and the sort of implications here.
So I think there's just quite a few implications. So looking at it from the domestic side, let's just talk specifically the United States. We know what the disease populations are and the increasing rate that they're growing every single year. And the challenge to me seems to be not just adoption, right? But, a lot of the things that are in the field currently commercially available are in the millions and millions of dollars price point, which is just not feasible, along the lines of insurance and things like that, which we may talk about a little bit later. But I think from an environmental standpoint, the population of patients that exist, that hasn't really changed much. So we just need to make sure whatever we're providing as a solution is not only effective, but also it's affordable, right, and accessible. So I'll stop there and then we'll kind of jump more into it. I know you have a couple other questions to talk about.
Yeah, well, so I'm curious, is the kind of push to accelerate through clinical trials to get that cost down to a point where people can actually purchase them? Is that what's going on?
I think part of it is that, but traditionally speaking, it takes a really, really long time to get to a clinical trial for phase 1, right? You're looking at somewhere between 7 and 10 years. And, investors, in the traditional sense, they want their return on investment. So the shorter you can shrink that timeline down or rapidly pivot to, a new modality or something to that degree, the better off it's going to be across the board and the more impact you can have on cost. There's a couple of recent publications that, I'll just highlight one because I'm a big fan of like ScaleReady's technology. I've always liked their stuff. There's a few other manufacturers I probably could highlight too, but I'll just start there. There was a publication that came out with Crystal Mackle's group from Stanford, right, talking about quite a few things as far as an all-in-one process, right, and utilizing the G-Rex and the benefits for that. I think that is one element to really reduce the overall cost of manufacturing. One challenge I see more so across the board, regardless of modality, is scaling up, right? So when you look at, research scale, then moving to process development, then looking at your early commercial trials, and then kind of getting to full commercial activity, many of the technologies that exist don't scale seamlessly across all of those junctures. So there seems to be a lot more pressure because thinking of it from a PI's perspective, right, not a company, there are other people that are going after the same disease model, right? The first person that gets to market typically is the first person that commands the most market share. We're seeing now a lot more environmental push for groups to be more collaborative, right? Which also goes against the stream of investing because you're an investor. You want your money back. You don't want to have to get in line with a whole bunch of other people, which is okay. The challenge is that is not the way science is going. If that was the case and we had CRISPR and one large pharma company acquired all the technology for CRISPR, we wouldn't have more than probably 5 clinical trials to date, right? So the benefit of knowledge share and access in that regard was now we have combinatorial therapies across many, many, many disease models, across academics, across pharmaceutical companies, even small and mid-sized biotechs that have grown at an exponential pace that would have never happened if it was only acquired by, one particular company. So now how can we do that and make the full manufacturing process scalable, regardless of the type of technology that we're using? I would also add in, licensing. I've had the privilege of working with groups that have either negotiated licensing or have a license as a part of their technology. And there are institutional, right? I'll put it like that, institutional roadblocks for signing on something with indefinite terms, right? Which also adds into the cost. So I think from that perspective, there's a lot of pieces that we can kind of delve into a little bit further. But I think ultimately from a PI's perspective, if I had the end in sight and I said, I want to get to a clinical trial and I don't want to spend more than, I'm gonna use a really egregious number, $1 million, right? That's not going to be possible with a 5 to 7 year timeline. It's just not, especially with highly specialized and technical people.
Yeah. There's burn rates. You're spending money every month. It makes sense. So knowledge sharing, that's something I'm quite interested to get into. So something I've noticed talking more to people on the sort of technical end is that there's a general sort of cultural thing, and it also has to do with intellectual property, where a lot of people make the same mistakes. And this is just overall really inefficient, where people are, making a mistake at company A, B, and C. So yeah, I'd love to hear what's kind of going on in the knowledge sharing space here.
Ooh, so that's a tough cookie to crack. From an institutional perspective, there's a lot of competition, and I'll deal with the academic, then we'll look at the corporate side. There's a lot of groups that are going after the same exact disease model, right? Their modality might be different or slightly different, or target might be slightly different, or the way that they're engineering whatever the product is might be slightly different. There's a combination of, I want to retain my IP, which is great. I have no problem with that. But there's also like, how far can we push that? And I think that line is kind of, it varies by institution. I've had the privilege of working with people all across the United States and even further. It really varies. That's a very big and moving target. I think looking at it from the collaboration perspective, right? Let's put it like that. I'm a fan of sharing information up to the point where you as an individual are comfortable.
Yeah.
Right. I can't lead one institution towards a particular factor that I wouldn't share with anybody else. What I can, however, do is I can ask very specific questions, right? And based on those answers, then it becomes more evident, like which particular route you may want to go or what you may want to explore. From a cost perspective, a lot of those, as you said, the A, B, and C companies making the same mistakes, a lot of that has to also do with sharing of the knowledge as far as training. So if we look back, let's just go back a little bit, let's say 5 years ago, right? Everybody was more focused on, viral mediated delivery for, foreign genetic payloads. So it was heavy lentivirus, heavy AAV. Then you look about 3 years ago, then you started to see a shift more towards in vivo, right? Where more people are moving towards mRNA or any of those modalities. But in between those two stages, there's a whole bunch of other modalities. There's, nanoplasmids, there's mini genes, there's all these different words that came out. There's, this type of HDR template. There was some that came out of some other groups out west with dedicated added templates that you can add in for gene knock-in as an example, or partial knock-in. All of these things are very good. They're very different. Some have their more benefit, but from a manufacturing standpoint, not a lot of manufacturers exist outside of lentivirus and AAV, right? You didn't have, 10 or 15 companies that are able to produce mini circles. You have more that are able to do mRNA, but as far as the delivery mechanism, right, you're still relegated to certain forms of delivery that are non-ex vivo outside of LNPs. So I think I think the industry, as far as publications, has boomed, but I don't think the adoption has boomed with the same degree that publications have come out.
Yeah, well, that's been one of the core themes we've sort of explored here, is this gap between science and repeatable manufacturing.
Yes.
And yeah, there's definitely a big distance between what's on the cover of Science and Nature magazine and what you can actually get at a CDMO today.
Yes. And I think ultimately with the CDMO aspect, you have varying quality, right, across CDMO, CRO, or other types of manufacturing organizations. And I think that's also presented its own bottleneck because there's been a lot of acquisitions. There's been companies that have had, larger reduction in forces, which also is partially driven by, the investing standpoint. So there's a lot of other factors that go in, and some of that, A, B, and C company making the same mistakes. Some of that is also environmental pressures as well too. I'm going to go and do what I know how to do because I know this will at least work and it'll get me through at least this phase. After that, we'll see what the next step looks like as far as funding and, potential commercialization.
Yeah, so it's sort of an approach of looking to the next milestone and not necessarily being laser focused on miles down the road.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, so we briefly touched on access and reimbursement. So this is something that's come up in a few conversations. Yeah, what's your take on what's going on there? There's sort of fact accreditations. Yeah, love to hear your thoughts and perspectives.
Well, I think from the cell therapy side, if I can just address that, we don't really see too many generic cell therapies that are out there, right? Which is, that those kind of push a little bit more pressure for the traditional manufacturers or the original IP holder to kind of reduce cost. So they don't really have that environmental pressure right now. I will say, looking from a global perspective, right, medical tourism is a very real thing, right? And there are, at least for me, right, I look at the cost for the same type of medicine. Like, I'm not looking at, oh, it's definitely this particular brand name that's made by this particular individual, this particular company. If we as a country, if we don't get ahead of this cost as early in the next like 5 years, there's going to be many other countries that will outpace us. One, for investment; two, for accessibility; three, for the fact that they already have the infrastructure set up and it's more of a collaborative informational sharing type relationship. I've worked with several countries abroad where they're like, this is the mandate by our government. We have to be at this point by this date. That's a very different problem than what we're trying to solve here, right? Everything for us is, let's retain IP. Let's be the first to commercialize. If we do choose to publish, it's only going to be a big splash publication. That's not the case overseas in many places. And then if you look at, further east or west, whichever you want to call it, the more Orient-based companies, there's a lot of investments that's coming out from some of these bigger technology companies. And even with all the SBIR grants adding in and several of the other investors that are coming with private equity, I don't think it's really rivaling as much as what we would need to rival, especially with the past couple of years where funding has been cut. Overseas, they're seeing in more of an insurgence of funding than they are any type of cut.
Wow. Well, this kind of leads to something else we've briefly touched on, which is investment in the is investment in the U.S. currently looking abroad, given these sort of capital markets? What's the sort of thinking there?
Yeah, there's been a few assets that have been targeted for acquisition. I don't know how much of it has made it into the public domain, so I'll err on the side of caution. But there have definitely been domestic entities that are looking abroad to bring in assets that have, developed to a much later stage, and they want to bring them to the U.S. market. Subsidization. But when you think about that compared to, there's a company over in China that I was reading about a few weeks ago that their claim is that they can make a therapy at like 10% the cost of U.S. manufacturing. Like, those numbers are astronomically different from what we're able to accomplish. Those are the types of things that I think really the industry as a whole should be looking more at and looking at ways to, again, I'm not against medical tourism. I don't know necessarily what the cost benefit is because I haven't done that. But if you're going to die, right, because you have a particular disease and it's progressing, I mean, you're going to die eventually anyway. Wouldn't it make sense? Hey, let me get rid of some stuff. Let me go overseas, see if I can potentially try something that may work. If it doesn't work, worst case scenario, I'm still in the same situation I was before I started. So those are other factors which I think at some point there may be a larger conversation. But medical tourism, again, is very real. And I do think it does have its place. And we'll see what that looks like over the next 10 years and what the impact, to our economy here looks like.
Yeah, I mean, the logic is sound. I mean, if the worst case scenario is what's going to happen anyway, yeah, I bet people are going. So, so a few things I'm sort of curious about in terms of these costs and the differences overseas. So we talked a little bit about manufacturing. There's clinical trials as well. Yeah, what are some of the things that are very different in costs between the US and elsewhere?
Well, firstly, there's quite a few other countries that have created their own manufacturing of specific modalities. So that in and of itself is also mostly government subsidized. So if you as a researcher, you come in, you say, hey, I want to build this particular product using this particular modality, and I need to scale from X to Z, right? What does that look like as far as cost? Their government already has that. It's at a reduced rate. Now, comparatively, there are a few places here that I know that they're manufacturing their own materials, right? And I'll keep it more broad. I'm not going to go specific. They're manufacturing their own materials as part of that process. So they can have access to things that are subsidized. But the large majority of groups are still getting different modalities from larger companies, which obviously when you start getting closer to GMP, that cost grows up pretty substantially. So I think those are factors that we have to look at. Those are different factors.
Yeah. So two things kind of come to mind now is so with GMP, there's obviously there's US regulations as to what that means.
Yes.
And the implications of taking advantage of cheaper manufacturing facilities outside. That's one thing. And the other thing that comes to mind is given these capital constraints and these domestic teams you're just mentioning,
yes,
having to look at 5 times reduction in cost, what's other than outsourcing abroad, how is that even possible? Yeah.
I would say, so one of the bigger parts is looking at where you're burning money at, right? What are the things that you can cut out? That's not going to reduce 5x, but that's going to be, when you add it up, it is a pretty large, substantial portion. Another factor is as early as research and development, before you've gotten to process development, before you even gotten to that lower end of scaling up, making sure that all of the technology that you're using, the manufacturers, you have that stuff locked in. Several of the groups that I've worked with and companies I've worked for, that has been one of the big stickler points, right? When once you get down to process development, it's a high likelihood that nothing is going to change. Once you get to full commercial access, when you're talking about phase 1 going into a phase 2, now your likelihood of change is a lot less. So the biggest thing is getting everything dialed in. Make sure you have, some of the larger master service agreements, right, where you have pricing locked in as best that you can to kind of tie those things down. The other part is there's always going to be experimentation. There's always going to be a new modality. Looking at being able to rapidly scale that up, those are the pieces that I would say that, at least for here, those are the pieces that we need to really, really focus on, the vast majority of it. All-in-one can be great as a manufacturing aspect, back to the, the G-Rex publication that I was talking about. Or if you go away from, all-in-one and you're looking at more modular systems, that's another way that you can potentially attack that hurdle. But again, it's bigger than just, I got this instrument, I'm able to secure the pricing for 3 and 6 months. What's the standard quote format is a month or 3 or 6. I'm looking at larger negotiations. I'm looking at having, quarterly business reviews. I'm looking at potential rebates, and I don't want to exclude smaller manufacturers, because that's not, some of the major industry changes have come from smaller groups. But if that particular group can't promise, right, to whatever degree that means, a more set price point, then maybe you might want to look at other possibilities. One other factor that I've seen is people are paying to expedite, right, to get closer to the front of the line. Those expediting fees are pretty astronomical. And I'm not saying it in a bad way. I'm just saying from a cost reduction standpoint, that's one of the areas that unfortunately a lot of people try to pay to get first in line, and that's where a lot of that cost ends up coming up. So those are things that I think from a cost reduction standpoint, we should definitely address. One other thing I would say is really, really important is the consistency of support, right? I cannot overstate that enough. And I feel like from many of the companies many of the groups that I've worked with, I've heard, negative feedback when it switches from, one dedicated group to another dedicated group, even within the same, company or institution. We have to look at ways to make sure things stay consistent. Stop just getting rid of this particular, scientist because they don't do, GMP manufacturing. It's like, well, you're familiar with all of the process from research and development all the way through process and development. But now because it goes behind these glass doors, you're no longer beneficial. In my professional opinion, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that groups make, and it ends up attributing to cost.
Yeah, that is a really significant cost. And one of the things we've sort of discussed in previous episodes is around tech transfer. So, we're talking about R&D, getting it into GMP, and consistency and cost. And my understanding is this can be one of those variable factors that can sometimes even sour these relationships, is the amount of time it takes to get from this worked in a vial to we can reproducibly manufacture it. So just curious what you're seeing.
From the tech transfer, so tech transfer really kind of applies to 2, maybe 3 areas, right? So you have the portion of we're taking the SOP and we're moving it over to a new location, whether it's at the same place, different building, different floor, whatever, or a completely different institution, right? That's a form of tech transfer. The next portion of that has to do with the reproducibility of manufacturing at that secondary location. In both cases, support is required, right? Because it's not just take and read this SOP and everything will go magically. It doesn't happen that way. And when you don't have somebody that really has that fine hand, right, where they really understand the not only the granular but also the larger picture, they see the forest for the trees, that increases a lot of cost. Because going from manufacturing location, let's just use an academic example, right? Going from University of ABC over to CDMO, XYZ, the cost to do that same run, let's just say it's $100,000, right? And all you're doing is giving that information saying, hey, can you reproduce this? Maybe we'll have a scientist come over and kind of watch. Typically the scientists don't know how to scale from, microliters up to, milliliters or liters, right? If you're talking full commercialability, you're looking at liters, right? And in a very large scale. The technology that's there is very different. So I would say from a simplistic standpoint, you need to have technical support that can go from every stage of this and continue to be a part of that think tank, right? To make sure that they're trying to solve the same problem. Just as important as it is for you to have them in the beginning, when you get to the other location, you need to have somebody that really understands the fine tuning of not the process development, right? But the actual moving into manufacturing. If there's something wrong, if the cells drop, like as an example in cell therapy, if the cells drop below a certain, confluency, if their viability changes, what are the things that we can do that are industry standards, right? That have a proven track record, but are not going to negatively impact the SOP as written by the client. Those are a piece of paper that is not going to tell you. You need a person that has experience to do that.
Yeah, so that makes total sense. And I'm curious if you're seeing a lot of variability, like within the market today. We're talking about support. Like it sounds like support is really, there's an opportunity to differentiate here.
Yes.
Are you seeing some that are much better than others, or is it kind of standardized?
So I've actually seen more companies that have been popping up. And again, I'm not going to mention any of the specific consulting companies, but there's a lot of companies that are popping up that claim to have more expertise or have more people as a part of their team that really have, transitioned, 20, 30, 40 different things into the clinic, right, at varying phases. That's an ideal solution. However, my only concern is how do we know which ones are good and which ones aren't? Because nobody's going to tell you I'm using this particular, consulting group to work with me. I'm not going to say it's bad. I get it because of, the IP and you want to keep the anonymity. But the other side is if I sign 20 contracts and of the 20 contracts, only 5 of them I complete, there needs to be some sort of a rubric that says, this is the metric for completion, right? This is the amount of money that went in. This is the amount of products that went out. And here's the potential impact to the market. Because if I'm in business development, those are the things that I have to look at, right? If I'm going to target a particular location, I need to know at that institution, they have a high success rate of potentially transitioning this product. If they don't, do I really want to spend as much time with them?
Yeah.
Right. what type of resources do I want to allocate towards that? Because there's a cost, regardless of whether it's me physically traveling there, whether I'm on Zoom, whether I'm on Teams, whatever, virtual or in person, there's a cost associated with that. So now the next step becomes, how can we as a country, right? I'm not just looking at specific consulting groups. How is it that we from the United States can particularly make things better, faster, more efficient at a lower cost point? I think we have a great knowledge base, right? I've worked with some of the brightest people literally over the past like 10 years that I've ever worked with in my life, including, going back to school and some of my professors. I feel that information is more readily available. I just think that as far as people spending the same amount of time to produce a single product, I think we need to cut that in half at least once or twice. Those are the pieces that we need to focus on. And if we can get that done and still enable information sharing, back to kind of our earlier topic, enable that while not infringing on IP, or even just producing, co-IP, right? Because at the end of the day, there's a high likelihood if it started in academia, it's not going to go all the way through phase 3 clinical trial at academia. It's probably going to be purchased by, one of the larger pharma companies. So those are the pieces, that's just kind of my thought process. I'm interested in hearing other experts. I've been on quite a few panels about this, so we'll see what happens over the next 5 years.
Awesome. Well, as we're sort of wrapping up, I'd be curious if you might have sort of one piece of advice. We're talking about cutting costs dramatically. What is, of all these pieces we've discussed in our conversation, what do you think is the one to prioritize most for upcoming companies that are pursuing development?
That's a hard question to answer. Let me give you two aspects. I'll start with the first one. If it's possible to purchase an asset, right, that you can just adopt, and then you're closer to a clinical trial, and it's going to shorten that hurdle by 5 years or 3 years, whatever. If that cost outweighs what you're going to put in to develop something from scratch, I'm 100% in agreement with just doing that, right? That's part one. Now, I say that with the caveat because typically, if it's that much further along, you have limited flexibility for the types of things that you can change, right? If you're buying platforms, you're looking at billions of dollars, right? Which is going to rule out the vast majority of smaller companies. There's a couple I can kind of, give caveats on that were recently acquired. But I would say that would be the first place that I would start. And the second place would be looking at ways to ensure that even if you did get rid of a portion of your platform or your process, if you're able to trade that in for something that can do, you can branch out to 10 different disease models, right? Versus just one where you have multiple prongs that you can go into. And then it's as simple as, well, all I need to do is change, this particular target, right? As we're talking CRISPR, this particular guide or modify this particular donor template. Those are things that I think more groups are going into. And that kind of, now you're more so doing like an automated car manufacturing process where, I'm just changing the colors, I'm changing the wheels, I might change the interior, but for all intents and purposes, when it leaves out, the time frame to produce it from the beginning to the end is still going to be the exact same thing. And if we can do that from a cell therapy manufacturing standpoint, that is really going to change the game and reduce costs pretty substantially. Again, these are just systems-wide things, but I really would like to say, looking at the pricing aspect of it, if there's situations where manufacturers decide that they're just going to ramp up the pricing, there needs to be specific carved out for things like that. And I've worked for companies and with companies that have that type of language that is specifically stated. No different than if, we come up with a master service agreement and you say, I'm going to commit to buying 100,000 of these. And at the end of the year, you've only bought 30,000 of those. What does that look like for the following year? That's more the side that I think we need to start pushing on as a country, rather than, because if not, the next best thing is going to happen is, places out in the Orient, they're just going to figure out ways to manufacture stuff faster and cheaper. And then, you're going to be ruled out and they have access to all of the information that you provided because they have to manufacture it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Well, you're not the first to bring up car manufacturing. In a previous episode with Scalability, we talked a lot about the Toyota way. And this whole approach of really dialing in a manufacturing, just an assembly line, essentially, just like any other sort of product. And one thing we briefly touched on that be really interesting to discuss a bit is around, we've talked about, these pieces that are like parts that you can widget together in your own way, or the sort of all-in-one systems, and also building into your sort of development plans an assumption that things will change and new innovations are going to come out, because they do.
Yes.
And yeah, I'm sort of wondering if taking the widget approach gives you better flexibility as you're assuming that the world in the next 2 or 3 years in the technology side is going to be different than the one when you're actually creating this plan.
Well, I think yes, to one degree, and largely because of AI, right? So there's a lot more AI-based platforms that are being used to not only mine data and publications, and actually quite a few of them are actually incorporated in some of the larger sharing platforms, where you can look up and like, I want to design this particular car. I need to know how many publications during this window use this particular type of manufacturing or this modality, right? So there's a lot of that is going on right now. But I would say from the widget standpoint, I would look more on the informatics side, and I would look at ways to design a better product first, and then look at that and use that as your springboard to say, now not only do we have a great design, now we have something that we can do, that we can make it more modular. Right. The thing, and kind of back to the G-Rex aspect again, I know their product very well. I've worked with that team across very, very, I think probably the past 4 or 5 companies that I've actually worked for. One of the things that I really like about that is the language is pretty universal. Right. When you say it's this particular thing, then you know that it operates in this particular tolerance with this number of cells. When they expand, it can get to this number before you have to go up to this next, this next device or this next apparatus. Those things are amazing. One other thing that I really like as well is, as far as like, the cell concentration and pieces like that, you don't really have to factor that in as much as you do with a lot of the other non-modular platforms, right? Or non-all-in-one platforms. So these are pieces that I think, well, let me take a step back. Do you remember back in, I think it was like 2021, 22, where there was a huge shortage of like different key reagents and supplies for manufacturing?
Oh, yeah.
So there was all of these publications that kind of popped up like, oh, well, we used to use this and we tried it worked really, really well. And there was a lot of comparisons. For me personally, that was something I found a lot of joy in, because there was a lot of that I knew that was going on with groups that I worked at, but it never made it out into the public domain. And of course, right, you're sworn to secrecy. So I'm like, well, if this works really well and it works better than that, like, why aren't you using that then? Like, explain that. Like, well, these are the reasons why from an institutional standpoint, these are the reasons why from a pricing standpoint, these are the reasons why for manufacturing. And ultimately it was because they couldn't lock in, specific agreements, because, the manufacturers had a little bit more, or a little bit less of a handle on how things were going to go up and down as far as pricing was concerned. One of the few products that didn't really have that issue as far as pricing increase was the Scale Ready product, which was awesome. However, adopting only one platform can be dangerous, especially if something happens where that company is acquired or any of a host of other things. That can be dangerous. So you always want to have a secondary. That being stated, many of the secondaries are not going to be at the same price point as your primary. And typically those decisions they get factored in differently. So if I remember, I think it was like I said, like 21, 22, I probably talked to, and I would say for every maybe 10 to 15 meetings I had, there were somewhere between 7 and 10 groups that were affected by a shortage in some way, shape, or form that was key to their manufacturer.
Yeah.
That is a crazy situation to be in.
Yeah.
And it's not like buying stuff from overseas is going to shorten that, because you still got to get all the way through import. You got to deal with that headache. So just, those are a couple of things that I think the industry really appreciated more. And I personally, as far as like the consulting side, like we talked about, I would love to see something like that where people, were a little bit more vocal, saying, I worked with these groups. These are the ones that I saw that turned out things a lot better. And I felt like the dollar value that they commanded is something that was really ideal, right, based on what they provided in the end result, I would work with them again. Right. Those are the types of testimonies. Those are the type of, comparatives that I would love to see more in the public domain. But that's just me as a person.
I mean, I think everyone, even outside of the cell therapy fields, will remember the pandemic because it really showed us the fragility of the supply chains in the entire world. So, yeah, what an insightful conversation. And
I was going to say it's funny, but when you think about it from a technology standpoint, there's, especially with with automotives, back to we gave the car example. There was a ton of technology that came out of countries out of the Orient that really kind of blew the technology in America away. And most of that stuff came out like mid-pandemic to going to kind of the latter portion. So clearly it wasn't a worldwide shortage in that space because there was technological advancement. I just feel like we need to make sure that we as a country here are putting forth that same type of effort from a larger standpoint, rather than just, I have these 10 institutions that get a lot of funding, and I have, these five corporate entities that have just secured, a combined $5 billion worth of, of assets. That's awesome. But that's only across a small product portfolio. That's only across a small patient percentage, right? When all of those things started occurring, and then looking at adoption in the time frame, these are all things that I think from a global perspective, any disease model that you throw out there, whether autoimmune, right, whether you're talking about specific forms of leukemia or any of a host of other things, non-genetic and or genetic, it needs to be modular, and we need to be able to embrace, and then the rollout from the other side and potential reimbursement, right? That's a whole different hurdle, and that's a larger conversation with some of the bigger insurance companies to figure out, hey, how quickly, once these things are produced, how quickly can you guys adopt these as potential therapeutics, and what would that look like? We started to see the shift with some of the the larger providers, where now you're not just doing one particular type of HMO or PPO, right? You're looking across an entire sector or entire industry and trying to get everybody under that industry under one larger umbrella. So those are the things that we kind of need to look at as far as the cell therapy adoption and reimbursement as well too.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it's almost sort of like a key man risk when you have a few groups, not actually a monopoly, but moving in that direction.
Yes.
As an industry, that's really it creates a sort of fragility in the supply chain that we might be taking for granted here.
That's right.
Wow. Well, yeah, it's been a super insightful conversation. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nico, for having me. Look forward to catching up and seeing this episode when it goes live.